Today our case brings us to Lisburn, County Antrim in Northern Ireland. Lisburn is a city 8 miles southwest of Belfast City, on the River Lagan, which forms the boundary between County Antrim and County Down. Here in this city was a place called Audley Avenue. It is considered a middle-class area and a relatively quiet area of Lisburn, a perfect place to bring up a family. It is here that the Gault family decided to set up home. Paul, 34, and Leslie, 33, were childhood sweethearts, and in the year 2000 they had 5-year-old triplets, a boy and 2 girls. Paul was described as a friendly family man who loved his children and spent as much time with them that his job allowed. He was the manager of transport for a hardware store in Belfast, and his work colleagues had nothing but good to say about him. When it came to his neighbours, they would say he was the type to keep himself to himself. People only really took notice of the Gault family because of the triplets. It was such a rare occurrence that people would stop them in the street to admire them. From the outside, the family seemed picture perfect. Leslie, Paul's wife, organised a mini breakaway without the children on the weekend of the 19th of May 2000. But this was no ordinary weekend away. There had been a lot of turbulence within the couple's relationship, and they were going away to try and rekindle their marriage and bring it back to what it once was. On the Friday morning, both Paul and Leslie dropped the children to school. This was a rare treat for Paul. After the children were to finish school, they would be picked up by Paul's parents, who were to mind them that weekend, while Paul and Leslie went on their much-needed break. After the children were dropped off, the two returned to the house, Leslie telling Paul that she had a few last-minute things to do in town and that she was also going to call to her parents. She asked Paul to pack the suitcases they would need for their trip to the Killyhevlin Hotel in Enniskillen. Leslie dropped Paul off at the gates to their house and watched him walk up the driveway to their front door, not knowing that it would be the last time she'd ever see him alive, or did she? Shortly after 11 a.m, Leslie returned to the family home. As she approached the back door, she saw that it had been forced open and the glass had been smashed. She shouted for Paul, but there was no answer. Panicked by now, she ran to a neighbour's house to raise the alarm. The neighbour went immediately inside the house and into the kitchen, where he saw that it had been ransacked. He then ran back to his house to phone for the police. Upon his return, he found Leslie sitting in the living room. She kept asking, "Where's Paul? We need to find Paul." With this, the neighbour went upstairs to the main bedroom and made a gruesome discovery. There, lying on the floor in the corner of the room, was Paul. The room was covered in blood, from the ceiling to the walls to the floor. Paul was covered in blood also, and it would later be said that he had been bludgeoned to death with a hockey stick. So severe was the attack that his head was caved in, not just with one blow, but with several. Whoever did this wanted to make sure he was dead, that there would be no witnesses to who the murderer was. Within minutes, police were on the scene, thinking they were attending a burglary at first, but then when they received a follow-up call from the same neighbour that a body had been found, the police were quick to respond. Upon seeing the body, a murder investigation began straight away. They noted that the whole house had been ransacked and not just the kitchen. That Paul, when he had returned home, had walked in on his house being robbed and was attacked. Investigators sealed off the house and began to forensically examine the scene. It was done in a very structured, meticulous and very measured way. They noted that the glass was initially cut with a special tool before being smashed, which they found unusual. Why would you cut the glass unless you knew that the keys were inside the lock? In the bedroom, Paul was found slumped on the floor in a sitting position with his head bent forward, and it was clear to the investigators that he had received severe trauma to the top of his head. They found a hockey stick and a hammer in the bedroom, and both were covered in blood. There was evidence of a jewellery box that had been opened and jewellery spilled out on top of the blood, which to investigators indicated that this was done after Paul was attacked. Another significant find was a sports bag found in the kitchen. They noted that inside the bag there was nothing of value: a PlayStation console, a glass vase and a few knickknacks. They also noted that the pulling out of drawers and a few things scattered about and the presence of the jewellery showed that the house looked staged, and therefore the real intention was murder. It was time now for the police to find out about their victim Paul and his family life. And who better to ask, besides the family, than neighbours? Sometimes they know more than the family themselves. They began doing house-to-house inquiries, and the neighbours knew quite a lot of what was going on in the Gault household. One person was mentioned time and time again. They had a nickname for him, the fireman. They knew his behaviours, the times he arrived and left the Gault house. The police wanted to find out who this fireman was, and was it possible that he was connected to the murder. The neighbours were able to give police the registration of the car that the fireman drove and the type of car, a white Vauxhall. They found out it was a vehicle owned by the Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service, and it was allocated to the Assistant Divisional Officer Gordon Graham, who was based at Fire Brigade headquarters on Seymour Street in Lisburn. Leslie, Paul's wife, also worked as an administrator here, and it didn't take long for the police to put two and two together. You see, back in December 1997, Leslie and Gordon were friends, but over the coming months this would turn into a full-blown affair. It wasn't just an affair, but it was a very passionate relationship that was bordering on infatuation on both sides, and it was obvious to everyone around them. It was well known at their work and in the neighbourhood that Leslie was carrying on with Gordon. The neighbours saw him coming and going from the Gault home frequently. They were caught being inappropriate at work and were spoken to by their superiors. It was said they became blinded to the reality of real life and were consumed with each other. Their own respective families were forgotten about. Leslie with her husband Paul and their children, and Gordon with his wife and their children. But this open secret would come out just 2.5 weeks before the murder. On the 1st of May 2000, Paul overheard a phone call between Leslie and Gordon. This was the first he knew about the affair, and 18 days later he was dead. Most of the articles I read, it was made out that Leslie told Paul of the affair, that she wanted to come clean and save her marriage. Others would say Paul found out. Leslie ended the affair and wanted to save her marriage. So I'm not sure which is right. It still had the same ending, unfortunately. By now, Gordon was the main suspect in Paul's murder, and when he was being interviewed by police, he was very calm, very controlled, and he had only one question: was he a suspect? He spoke openly with police about his affair with Leslie, and when they searched his locker in work, they found 11 love letters between Gordon and Leslie. They spoke about their love for each other in these letters, and the fact that Paul knew about the affair shouldn't have an effect on them. Gordon spoke of them escaping together, and this gave the police a whole new outlook on the intensity of the relationship. That Paul, in Gordon's eyes, was an obstacle that needed to be removed. Gordon being so candid about his relationship with Leslie did have an effect on forensics. The fact that the affair spilled over to him being at the Gault's home, it wouldn't be a surprise to find evidence of DNA belonging to him there, and so the police could not rely on anything they found in relation to Gordon. As for his alibi, Gordon said he went to work the morning of the murder, booted up his computer and then began building questions for a table quiz. He then said he went to Bow Street in Lisburn looking for a present for his wife, and then he went to pay his credit card bill. CCTV footage was taken from the businesses on Bow Street. Gordon did not appear anywhere that day. He was the man that was never there. The police now were also able to establish the time of Paul's death, because the next door neighbour happened to be hanging a picture in a room that shared a wall with the Gault bedroom where the murder took place. The neighbour noted the time he heard noise in the room next door, and it was between 9 a.m. when Leslie dropped off Paul at the house and 9:10 a.m. when he looked at his clock. The glass in the back door was forensically examined, and it was double glazed, patterned and toughened. The sports bag was also examined for DNA, and it matched to Gordon, and he had denied it was his bag. Bloodstaining was also found belonging to Paul, showing that the items were placed in the bag after the murder. The clothes that Gordon was wearing that morning were handed over to police, and they too were examined. A number of pieces of glass were found in the shirt in the top breast pocket and in the thread of his shoes, which matched the glass from the back door. This put Gordon squarely at the scene of the murder on that morning. Once all this evidence came together, the police felt they had a strong case moving forward, so they arrested Gordon for the murder of Paul. He pleaded not guilty and he was remanded in custody. While Gordon was in prison, the police were able to monitor his phone calls to his wife. This would turn out to be fruitful. Over the course of these phone calls, his wife was challenging him on what happened. At one point, she said to him, "How stupid could you be to use your own bag?" As for Leslie, she was the one with all the information as to their movements that morning. In order for Gordon to lie successfully in wait for Paul, he would have needed to know that he was doing the school run and not in work as he normally would have been. There was speculation that Leslie had given Gordon a key to the house so he could let himself in and lie in wait, and that the glass in the back door was broken after the murder, but this was never proven. Leslie was also arrested and charged with the murder of Paul in May 2000. She was released on bail. They would be tried together at Belfast Crown Court in August 2000. Neither of them made eye contact during the trial, so much for their undying love for each other. While Gordon was cocky and unbothered, Leslie looked particularly uneasy and embarrassed when their love letters were read out in court. The prosecution stated that Leslie was the one who arranged the logistics of the attack. In a rebuttal, the defence said that the affair had ended weeks before the murder, and that Gordon could have easily found out the information needed to carry out the murder without Leslie's help. At the time, it was one of the biggest domestic murder trials in Northern Ireland. Gordon was found guilty by a unanimous verdict and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 20 years, which was later reduced to 18 years. When it came to Leslie, they were not able to reach a verdict and a retrial was ordered. At the second trial in March 2003, based on the evidence of the first trial, Leslie spoke about how she hated Gordon and that it was him who always pursued her. However, it was noted in court that on the day of Paul's funeral, despite the claims that the affair was over, Leslie had been in contact with Gordon by phone. She said she had no part in the murder but felt morally responsible as it was her affair with Gordon that led to Paul's death. She was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. While Leslie was in the women's prison Mourne House, which is situated at the outer walls of the Category A high security Magaberry prison near Lisburn, an informant blew the whistle about romps between prison officers and inmates. Prisoner Colin MacDonald sent explicit cartoons portraying sex sessions to prison authorities. His drawings were said to be so accurate that the Northern Ireland Prison Service could identify staff members involved. 5 officers were fired for allegedly having sex with Leslie Gault. 3 of the 5 had also been accused of having sex with Julie McGinley, who had her husband Gerald McGinley murdered in August 2000. It was also said that she had sex with 2 other officers. One of the prison officers involved with Leslie was a married man at the time, and it was said that love letters from Leslie were found in his locker, and they had exchanged 130 phone calls according to phone records. This officer would go on to live in Leslie's home, and the relationship ended shortly afterwards. The 2 women were busy little bees. Leslie appealed her conviction and it was overturned on one point of the appeal, so she was granted a 3rd trial, and with this she was acquitted of the murder of her husband in September 2004. This was a shock to everyone, even to Leslie. She turned to the prison guard to confirm what her ears were hearing. With this verdict, she burst into tears, and as she walked out of the courtroom, she turned to the jury and thanked them. She was a free woman. The Gault family were devastated. They even had applied for full custody of the children when Leslie was convicted, and now they had to hand them back. They firmly believed that Leslie had an equal hand in Paul's murder, and now they live with the fact she will never pay for what she did. This murder was premeditated, brutal, and carried out without any mercy. Leslie would say, quote, "I have been through a nightmare which is almost unimaginable, bereaved, imprisoned, and vilified." Leslie became a born-again Christian and went on to marry Jeremy Burke in 2008, after meeting at a local church. In 2017, they left Northern Ireland and moved to Carrick-on-Shannon in Leitrim to set up the Lakeland Elm Church, a Pentecostal faith church. Gordon was released from prison in 2021. Gordon was described as quite an arrogant man. You could tell this by all the police interviews he did, where he was cocky to say the least. The fact he handed over his clothes voluntarily, thinking the police wouldn't find anything. How open he was about his affair with Leslie. He saw Paul as the only thing that was getting in the way of him being with Leslie forever. Numerous times he spoke in the letters of how Paul was going to lose, that he was going to take Leslie, that he was going to take his children, that he was going to be the winner. Once Paul found out about the affair, Leslie had told Gordon that they were over, that she wanted to work things out with Paul and stay. Gordon was not able to cope with this rejection. He thought that she had been brainwashed and that her true feelings were for him and not Paul, and so it was then he decided to take his life. But in the midst of this tragedy were three young triplets aged 5, one of whom, Jonathan, has spoken out about his ordeal following his father's murder. He said a lot of people didn't believe his mother was innocent, but he and his siblings did and still do. They have talked about their father's death with her. For Jonathan, the trauma led him to turning to drink and drugs in his teenage years. Growing up, they were very poor. People made fun of their clothes and he felt like an outcast in his own community. He was angry about everything, the situation, the courts, the man who took his father's life. Jonathan eventually got himself sober and he visits his father's grave on a regular basis. Jonathan quoted his father saying, "These things happen, it's time to move forward, life is worth living. Rest in peace, Paul."